It certainly is very cold today. Minus 18 degrees in fact. We are currently in Jasper and we're about to start driving on the next leg of our journey. Despite the fact that it is minus 18, the battery is actually not as cold. It's not warm, that's for sure, but it's a lot better than minus 18. Let me show you. How did the battery temperature remain above zero when clearly the ambient temperature is way below zero? There is a small trick you can use to somewhat preheat the battery before long trips, and keep watching to find out how. Welcome everyone to Ready Steady Charge. My name is Solomon, and today let me take you on a journey through the Rocky Mountains. We are going from Edmonton to Jasper, and then from Jasper to Field, and then from Field all the way to Calgary. The temperature was very cold. It was minus 31 degrees some of the days. And I am recording the audio after the trip. And the purpose of this video is to show how my EV, the Hyundai Kona Electric, performs under these winter conditions and low battery temperatures. And I want to see how these conditions affect the vehicle's performance throughout the trip. Just to clarify, I have the 2020 Hyundai Kona Electric, and this is the 64 kilowatt hour battery version. And since I got mine in Canada, it does come with a battery heater. I will show you all of the relevant data for each leg of the journey on the screen. So you can pause the video if you want to take a more detailed look at the numbers. I won't be talking about all of them. I'm mostly focused on consumption, battery temperature, and the charging speed. I will show you the battery temperature on this nifty little device, a OBD display that is connected to a OBD dongle via Bluetooth. Watch this video right here to get a little more information about this useful little device. Let's begin. We started the trip from Edmonton with 99% battery, and the ambient temperature is actually minus 25 degrees. The temperature sensor on the vehicle needed some time to adjust because it was in an underground parkade overnight. Let's take a look at the temperature readings. Actually, before we do that, I think it's a good time to explain to you what you're actually looking at on the OBD display and what these numbers actually mean. Let's start from the top. The first number you see is the battery voltage. This is the voltage of the traction battery in the vehicle. This is not a number that we will pay much attention to because the battery voltage increases and decreases with the battery percentage, and is not super useful to us when we're focusing on the battery temperature. The next one is the battery temperature measured in degrees Celsius, a very important metric on this trip. The Kona has 4 battery modules, each with its own temperature sensor. And the number you see here is the average of the reading from all 4 modules. The modules in the Kona's battery do not vary much by temperature. Most of the time, the modules have a difference of around 2 degrees Celsius. The most I have seen is actually just 4 degrees Celsius, which means this average number is an accurate representation of what is actually happening in all 4 modules. The next number is battery power. This is a number that represents the net power coming out or going into the battery. It will accurately reflect how much power is being used by the vehicle overall. When it is red, there is a net output of energy, and when it is green, there is a net input, for example, when charging or during regenerative braking. The last one is the heater temperature. As far as I know, the heater temperature is a measurement of the coolant temperature near the battery heater. So I will refer to this as coolant temperature from now on. It will go up when the battery heating is running, and it will go down when the battery cooling is running. The exact number doesn't matter as much as the changes in the number. It is an accurate indicator of when the heater is on, and this number does not change when you're running the heating in the cabin. In this cold, the coolant temperature will quickly drop when the battery heating is not running. And just to make it convenient for you, I will place this little indicator here on the screen when the battery heater is actually on or off, so you can understand what's happening. We are starting with 10 degrees Celsius in the battery, simply due to being parked in an underground parkade, shielding it from the minus 25 degrees temperature outside. The coolant is 12 degrees, which is close to the temperature inside the parkade. Let's start our journey. The distance between Edmonton and Edson is 205 kilometers. This leg of the journey took just over 2 hours. The road is partially covered in snow and ice and is slippery. Not the easiest highway driving, of course. I drove at or just under the speed limit of 110 kilometers per hour. I think it's dangerous to drive any faster. In planning for this trip, I wanted to keep my consumption better than 4.0 kilometers per kilowatt hour. This will allow me to arrive at all my destinations with a good buffer, and it is possible to do with some care. Cabin heating can use a significant amount of energy, especially in temperatures this low. What I have noticed for the Kona Electric is that the defroster actually uses a lot more energy and heats more aggressively than other cabin heating settings. So I choose to use manual control rather than automatic control. For almost the entire trip, these are the cabin heating settings I have used. I kept the cabin temperature at 18 to 20 degrees. I used the setting for blowing under my feet most of the time. The fan setting is at 3 to 4. And whenever the fog starts to form on the windows, I briefly turn on the defroster and turn it back to, blowing under my feet when the windows are clean. I find this will keep the cabin comfortable as long as I have some winter clothing on. And I use the heated seats and heated steering wheels a lot, since those use very little energy compared to heating the air. Now that I'm nice and comfortable, what about the battery? An EV's battery produces heat when it's being discharged. And the faster you drive, the faster the discharge. And therefore, the more heat will be produced. In essence, the battery should heat up as you drive. But the heating up process will eventually reach an equilibrium. The equilibrium depends on the ambient temperature. So the lower the ambient temperature, the lower the equilibrium temperature your battery can maintain. As I drove, I noticed that the battery discharge could only maintain the 10 degrees we had started with, and that's what I arrived with in Edson. We have arrived in Edson at one of the charging stations. This specific site has 6 Tesla destination chargers and 2 Flow 50 kilowatt chargers. Our consumption is 4.3 kilometers per kilowatt hour, and we arrived with 22% battery. The battery temperature is 9.5 degrees, which means the heat produced by driving only maintained the battery temperature we started with. The coolant cooled way down to minus 15, so let's plug in. The Kona, unlike a lot of other EVs, has a front-facing charge port. One of the downsides of the charge port on the Kona is that when driving through the snowfall, the snow goes beneath the outer cover. But the charge port has an inner cover as well, so as long as you clean the snow a little bit before you take off the inner cover, it should be fine. The inner cover fits tightly over the receptacle of the charge port and remains reasonably clean underneath. I have shot a time lapse of this charging session. Before we take a look at that, let me tell you how the state of charge of the battery and the temperature of the battery affects charging speed. Long story short, all EVs charge the fastest from 0% state of charge to 80% state of charge. And the EVs will charge slowly, going from 80% up to 100%. For the Kona Electric, if you have warm enough battery temperature, the fastest charging speed occurs between 0% and 74% and slows down above 74%. Let's discuss the battery temperature in more detail. Simply put, the warmer the battery, the faster the charging speed. The first critical temperature for the Kona's battery is 1 degree. This is where the Kona can charge at 24 kilowatts. That's kind of slow. The next critical temperature is 6 degrees. This is where the Kona can charge up to 39 to 42 kilowatts, and this is a decent speed for the Kona Electric. The next critical temperature is 15 degrees. This is where the Kona can charge up to 57 kilowatts. And the next critical temperature is 25 degrees. This is where the Kona can charge up to 75 kilowatts. And 75 kilowatts is the maximum charging speed of this vehicle. The critical temperature above that is actually 37 degrees. This is where the battery cooling actually kicks in. Now, under these super cold conditions, this is not going to be relevant. Given that we arrived with 10 degrees, it is above the critical temperature of 6 degrees. This means the Kona charges at around 40 kilowatts. Let's take a look at the time lapse of this charging session. Immediately after plugging in, we are charging at 40 kilowatts as reported by the vehicle. The OBD display is showing 36 kilowatts of net charging speed. This is because both the cabin heater and the battery heater are running. The cabin heater is using around 1 to 2 kilowatts, while the battery heater pulls around 2 to 3 kilowatts. I will put up the vehicle's display once in a while so you know what the gross charging speed actually is. The coolant heats up fairly quickly compared to the battery itself, and that's because the battery is a very large object with higher specific heat capacity compared to the coolant. So it takes really warm coolant to warm up the battery. When plugged into a 50 kilowatt charger like this Flow charger that we are using, the Kona's battery heater aims for a target temperature of around 15 degrees. The heater does not aim for 25 degrees because the charger is not capable of providing 75 kilowatts. So at 17 degrees, we see a spike in the coolant temperature. This is actually a sign that the heater has stopped working. There is an explanation for why this occurs, but it will take a long time to explain. Let me know in the comments if you're curious. The heater stops heating at 17 degrees, and immediately after, the charging speed increases. The charging session continues, and the battery heats up further from the charging process without intervention from the battery heater. At around 72%, the charging speed throttles down. This is where the charging speed drops at around 74%. It doesn't always happen at 74%. I found that it could have happened at 71 to 76, but in general, the charging speed drops at around 74%. With the battery heater off, the coolant temperature drops because it is just so cold outside. And we finished the charging session at 86% with the battery temperature at 27 degrees. The entire charging session took 1 hour and 11 minutes. I didn't really have to stay this long, but I wanted to film this complete session for charging up to 85%. And I needed to eat lunch and purchase some windshield washer fluid from a nearby gas station. It is time to head to Jasper. The next stop is Jasper. The distance is 166 kilometers. It will take around 2 hours. And that's because once we've entered the national park, the highest speed limit is 90 kilometers per hour. I am going to the DC fast chargers in Jasper. I don't really have to do that since I am staying in Jasper for a few days, and I can just use a level 2 charger. But I want to see what kind of battery temperature we arrive with and what kind of charging speed we can achieve. We left Edson with 27 degrees in the battery, and it will drop as we drive, especially in this type of cold weather. But the question is by how much? This leg of the journey is similar to Edmonton and Edson. The road is very slippery and careful driving is needed. When I'm close to Jasper, there are a few places where there is complete whiteout with very limited visibility. Definitely need to slow down in those places. After 2 hours, I arrived in Jasper. The consumption is 4.8 kilometers per kilowatt hour, which is better than the previous leg of the journey. And that's because the average speed is slower. The ambient temperature is now at minus 23 degrees. My destination for the day is the Fairmont in Jasper, and they do have multiple level 2 chargers on site. But I wanted to see what kind of charging speed I can get using a 50 kilowatt DC fast charger. And I was in for a surprise. My vehicle is not cold gating, but it looks like the charger is cold gating. Let me show you what I mean. I arrived with 36% battery, and that means I charged a little bit too much in Edson, but that's fine. The battery is at 12 degrees, and the coolant is at minus 10. What I thought would happen is the following. Since the battery is above 6 degrees, when I plug in, it should be around 40 kilowatts. But that's not what happened. I plugged in and I got 33 kilowatts. That's quite slow, and I braved the cold and went outside to see what is happening at the charger. The charger says it's limited to 37 kilowatts, when normally it should be 50 kilowatts. I did try all 3 chargers and they all show the exact same thing. I came here 2 months ago and used the very same charger and they provided 50 kilowatts. The only major difference I can see is in the weather and in the temperature. 2 months ago, it was 4 degrees, and now it is minus 23. My first thought is, well, could the charger be cold gating? This seems to be the most direct answer to why this is happening. But I thought for a little more, and I don't think that's quite the case, because I had done a cold temperature charging test with the Kona on another flow charger of the same design, and the ambient temperature at that point was minus 30, and it still provided 50 kilowatts, so I don't think the answer is that simple. After thinking about this some more, I have a couple of theories. The first theory relates to the weather. And not only is it cold, but it's extremely windy. And I will turn on the audio for you so that you can actually hear what is going on. Could it be that the wind actually chilled a sensor inside the charging station so much so that it perceived the temperature to be a lot colder, and therefore it reduced charging speed? The second theory is that maybe the chargers are fine, but the other pieces of equipment supplying power to the chargers are cold gating. Maybe those have more sensitive sensors than the chargers themselves. My third theory is that the power limit didn't have anything to do with the charging infrastructure, but rather has something to do with the local grid. Maybe there was a power limit applied to chargers because more power is needed elsewhere. Perhaps when I plugged in, it was considered peak time for energy usage in the rest of the town, and power output is reduced to the chargers. I don't know for sure what actually reduced the charging speed for these charging stations, so if you have some ideas, put in the comments below. While I am alternating between the 3 different chargers, they did warm up the battery somewhat. However, the charging speed never went above 37 kilowatts. All 3 chargers worked, albeit at a reduced charging speed. It is getting dark and I need to get to the hotel ASAP. Driving out here in the dark with heavy snowfall is quite dangerous. During my stay in Jasper, I took 2 excursions south of Jasper on Highway 93. This highway is also called the Icefield Parkway. I want to show you how the vehicle performs in the extremely cold weather. And just so you know, the entire highway of Highway 93 has the highest speed limit of 90 kilometers per hour. But first, I want to talk about the charging infrastructures at the Fairmont to give any potential patrons an idea of what kind of charging infrastructure is available. The Fairmont has 3 charging locations on site with level 2 chargers, 2 of which are meant for customers. One of these is in parking lot 3. There is one Tesla destination charger and one J1772 plug, so you can charge 2 vehicles at once. The other site is parking lot 2, where there is only one Tesla destination charger. The last one is a J1772 right next to the fire hall. This one we've actually used during our 3,000-kilometer road trip. But this one is meant mostly for Fairmont's own Nissan Leaf, and it's not available all of the time. For most of my stay, I used the J1772 level 2 charger in parking lot number 3. The maximum charging speed is 6.2 kilowatts. It's not the fastest level 2 charger ever, but it's not bad. The first trip I took was to a location 17 kilometers south of Jasper to go hiking in an area called the Valley of the Five Lakes. We are starting with 25 degrees in ambient temperature. The battery temperature is minus 25 as well, and the coolant temperature was minus 26. So basically, the battery and the coolant are the exact same as the ambient temperature. It looks like the Kona has made no attempt to warm up the battery even when the battery is fully charged. The consumption on this trip will be unusually high because I'm actually using the cabin heating really aggressively. I wanted to drain the battery down to around 80% so that I can do a charging test when I came back. The vehicle started driving without any problems. While I was driving, I noticed that the battery heater turned on briefly. It warmed the battery up to minus 24 degrees and then turned off. So it looks like the Kona thinks the battery is too cold at minus 25 when driving, and minus 24 is just good enough. Around 25 minutes later, I arrived at the trailhead for Valley of the Five Lakes. The battery temperature had increased to minus 19 with the discharge of the battery during the drive. The coolant temperature is at minus 18, and that's because it warmed up briefly when trying to bring the temperature of the battery up to minus 24. I hiked through the loop of the first lake, which is around 8 kilometers. I brought my snowshoes with me and did have to use them for some of the trail. It was a lovely hike where I was on my own the entire time. It was silent and serene. Only my footsteps and myself. 3 hours later, I finished the hike and returned to my vehicle. I'm not too sure what is happening with the outside temperature reading, but the outside is actually around minus 25 at this time. So I don't know what's happening there. The battery and the coolant both cool down a little bit. The battery is now at minus 19 and the coolant is at minus 20. Given how cold it is outside, this reduction in temperature is not surprising. I drove back the way I came at a total of 35 kilometers on this trip. The consumption is 3.3 kilometers per kilowatt hour, which is really high. But like I said, I purposefully used the cabin heating aggressively to run the battery down to closer to 80%. When we arrived, the battery ended up being at 82%. With 17 degrees as the battery temperature and 19 degrees as the coolant temperature. Again, the battery did warm up a little bit due to the discharge while driving. So the key takeaway here is that the Kona's thermal management system is kind of stingy in terms of warming up the battery outside of the context of charging. So when you're not plugged in and charging, the battery heater almost never turns on to keep the battery warm. So 99% of the time, when you're driving, the battery heating only occurs due to the discharge of the battery. And a short drive of 35 kilometers like this will not warm the battery up by a lot. On the other hand, it seems like the Kona does not mind this battery being cold, so it does not use any energy and try to keep it warm, even when winter mode is turned on. Just to let you know, not all EVs are like this. Some EVs are more generous with their battery heating, or more wasteful with their battery's energy. Depends on how you look at it. The next excursion I took was to go see two different waterfalls, the Athabasca Falls and the Sunwapta Falls. The trip is 62 kilometers one way, which means it is a total of 124 kilometers. This time I will use the cabin heating normally, just enough to keep me warm. The previous evening, I did a battery preheating test which raised the battery temperature to 8.5 degrees at around 8:30 p.m. The battery, of course, had cooled off overnight, but is still higher than the ambient temperature. For this trip, we started with a battery temperature of minus 20 degrees, and the battery coolant is sitting at minus 25. As you would have realized by now, the coolant cools down very quickly to match the ambient temperature. The ambient temperature is minus 24 degrees, which is similar to the previous drive. And off we go. As I started driving, I noticed that there was more and more snow covering the road the further I drove along Highway 93. There are definitely lots of places where reducing speed below the speed limit is a good idea. And winter tires are a must. 40 kilometers later, we arrived at Athabasca Falls. As we drove, the battery did warm up passively. The battery heater did not turn on, and we arrived with 86% battery with the battery temperature at minus 15. The coolant is at minus 23, which is exactly the same as the ambient temperature. Let's go visit the waterfall. It's so cold that so much water froze, but the water still flows and you can see it through the holes in the ice. After a quick visit, we returned to the vehicle. The battery and coolant temperature is still the same. We are going to visit Sunwapta Fall next. We drove under similar conditions for another 22 kilometers and arrived. The entire facility area had been covered by a thick layer of snow. This is true Canadian winter. The battery is at 77% now, and the temperature increased to minus 12. So it did warm up some more. The coolant is at minus 13 with the ambient temperature at minus 18. So it's a little warmer here compared to the previous area. As I exited the highway, I noticed a few vehicles parked on the road. When I got out to look, I realized the road had not been cleared and these visitors had chosen to walk down the road to the waterfall. I didn't feel like walking all the way there, so I started my drive back to Jasper. We finally arrived at the Fairmont, and the whole trip was 127 kilometers with a consumption of 4.8 kilometers per kilowatt hour. Considering the ambient temperature, which is minus 23, this consumption number is pretty good. We arrived with 61% battery, and the battery temperature is minus 7.7. The coolant is at minus 17, cooling down closer to the ambient temperature. All in all, I would say the passive heating of the battery is actually not bad. For 127 kilometers of driving, the battery went from minus 20 degrees to minus 7.7, and we still have 61% battery left and plenty of range. So if we drove a longer distance, the battery will warm up even more. If you decide to plug into a DC fast charger right now, the charging speed is probably going to be around 20 kilowatts, which is kind of slow. And the charging speed will only go up once the battery temperature has reached higher temperature due to the battery heater. So that will take some time. The good thing is, I'm not driving until the next morning, so the level 2 chargers at Fairmont is more than good enough.